Okay. Well, I have a few introductory remarks to make before I introduce our special guest here. First of all, I wanted to recap from last week uh, where I think we are in thinking about logical vocabularies as fitting in among metavocabularies of reason, which is the overarching topic. So first of all, logical vocabularies are vocabularies. That is, there's a logical lexicon plus reason relations defined on sets of the sentences from the lexicon. And second of all, they're metavocabularies. That is, the reason relations of the logical vocabulary are determined by the features of some other vocabulary, the base vocabulary of that metavocabulary. Third, they're what I call rational metavocabularies. That is, their reason relations are determined by the features, are determined by the reason relations of the base vocabularies. In this way, they contrast with, for instance, pragmatic metavocabularies, whose reason relations are determined by practical features of the use of the base vocabulary. Fourth, logical metavocabularies are conservative extensions of their base vocabularies, both with respect to their lexicon and with respect to the reason relations. Fifth, I think of logical vocabularies as LX for their base vocabularies. That is, they're elaborated from, that's the L, and explicative of, that's the X, the reason relations of the base vocabularies. And I suggested that logical vocabularies, though this isn't true of all of them, should aim at being universal and comprehensive. That is, they should be LX for every vocabulary, and in each logical extension of a base vocabulary, they should explicate not only the reason relations of the base vocabulary, but of the logically extended vocabulary as well. So that's the picture of logical metavocabularies that I mean to have put on the table in the last 2 weeks. And last time Dan showed NMMS, our favorite logic that claims to be universal and comprehensive in that regard. Now, today we're moving on to think about semantic metavocabularies. And I think of the defining task of semantic metavocabularies is to determine the reason relations of their base vocabularies. Formal semantic theories of meanings expressed by declarative sentences, those meanings of expressed by declarative sentences, I call claimables. Some people talk about propositions. I think there's a good reason not to use that term. Appeal to a structured universe of items from which they draw what, to use the most neutral terminology I can, I'll call semantic interpretants that are assigned to those sentences. And that assignment of semantic interpretants drawn from the structured universe of items has the job of specifying the functional roles that those sentences play in reason relations of implication and incompatibility. Now, an important point here is, if I can remind you of this mandala of metavocabularies, that the arrow from semantics goes to the reason relations. The arrow connecting the reason relations to logic goes in the other direction, because the job of logic is to express the reason relations. The reason relations are, as it were, in the driver's seat there. What we looked at in the first couple of weeks, the pragmatics, there the arrow is also going from the pragmatics to the reason relations, because the pragmatics, the use of the expressions, is what determines the reason relations. implication, commitment to accept all the premises, precludes commitment to reject, at least to reject all of the conclusions, and similarly for incompatibility. We understand the reason relations in terms of pragmatics. Well, semantics aims to explain the reason relations, to determine them independently in the same way, well, at any rate, at the same level as the pragmatics does. Whereas the logical metavocabularies, as I'm thinking of them, are creatures of the reason relations. They are downstream from them, expressive of them. Now, what we'll see today, the story that Ulf is going to tell us, is about a very interesting relation between the pragmatic determination of reason relations and the semantic determination of reason relations. And I thought that to introduce the notion of semantic metavocabularies, I would give a quick sort of breathless rehearsal of what I think of as the four dominant approaches in semantics, which are nested. Each one has the expressive power of the one before it, plus some more. And now this is very quick, but I thought it would be helpful to have available in the sort of potted version on the handout, a survey, a summary of these four approaches. So the first one, I think, real semantics, Frege is a very complicated case who kicked all of this off. But in the last 100 years, about 100 years ago, in the 1920s, we got the two-valued bipolar semantic metavocabulary for classical logic. Remember, I talked about pragmatic bipolarity of acceptance and rejection as paralleling the semantic bipolarity, bivalence of the true and the false. And here, the universe from which we draw our semantic interpretants is the set of two, well, they're called truth values, but it doesn't matter so much what they are. There's two of them. We think about implication as truth preservation from premises to conclusions, and two sets of sentences, X and Y, are incompatible. Well, in this framework, that's read as inconsistent, in case there's some sentence that the one says is true and the other of the incompatibles says is false in this setting. So if X implies A and Y implies not A, then X and Y are incompatible. Their union is inconsistent. Now, this is very basic, but all of the more sophisticated, more expressively powerful semantic metavocabularies that come afterwards include, as a special case, this crude representation of meaning, but it's where it all starts. And I want to mention for future reference that very soon, by the late 20s and early 30s, there was a variant of this. People saw how you could generalize the two-valued semantics for classical logic to three-valued, in general, multi-valued, what came to be called matrix-valued semantics. These were, in some sense, a curiosity until about 10 years ago, when there was a real revival of interest in multi-valued logics, mostly for addressing semantic paradoxes, but a new interest in the classic three-valued logic, strong Kleene, K3, when it came to be seen as the dual logic to Graham Priest's new logic LP, the language of paradox. And since then, non-transitive logic, the strict tolerant logic ST, and its inverse TS. There's been a flurry of activity with these multi-valued logics. These were all three-valued logics in the last decade. And I'll be saying something about that, and Dan will be saying something about that next week. So I just wanted to register that that was there. Huge generalization of that classical two-valued logic due to Tarski, picked up philosophically by Carnap, though Tarski did the original work in the late 30s. It's really the 40s and the 50s is when model theoretic semantic metavocabularies for extensional base vocabularies were introduced. Here, the universe from which we draw our semantic interpretants is a set of what Tarski called models. The little S's, when I use that on the handout, those are scare quotes. You can find a semantics for them and make it explicit if you care. They're called models, but it doesn't matter what they're called. Each sentence is assigned as its value a set of models, a set of points from the universe. That's its semantic interpretant. Implication is by set inclusion. Gamma implies A. If all the models of all the sentences in gamma are also models of A, then gamma implies A. And incompatibility is not having a model in common. Here the slogan is a model is a proof of consistency. If some set of sentences has a model, then it's not incoherent. And I'll note, because we've been concerned with the structure of reason relations, whether it's closed, monotonic and transitive, or open, that if the semantic interpretants are sets, as I said, it doesn't matter whether they're sets of models or whether you call what they're sets of models or not, if you define implication by set theoretic inclusion relations among sets of points from the universe and incompatibility by disjointness of sets, you bake into your semantic apparatus monotonicity and transitivity. You bake in the closure structure of the reason relations that you can determine by this sort of semantics. Now, it's important that I'm describing all this at the level of sentential semantics. One of the fancy and important advances of model theory was to be able to handle subsentential logical structure, quantifiers, identity, and so on. But we're not looking at that level. Thinking just at the level of sentences is, on the one hand, complicated enough, and on the other hand, ignoring that substructure gives you, in many ways, I think, a cleaner picture of the overall situation. Third development, which has the model theoretic one as a special case, well, it means to, and it's usually treated that way. There's some subtleties there. Etchemendy's book, The Concept of Logical Consequence, makes the case that we shouldn't be so quick to think of model theory, to think of possible world semantics as a generalization of model theory. But I'm going to bracket those sophisticated concerns. This is from the 1960s now, late 60s. Kripke introduces a revolution in modal logic by giving a semantics for modal logics. The universe of semantic interpretants is a collection of what he calls possible worlds, but again, it doesn't really matter what the points in the universe are, it's the structures on them. And each sentence is assigned a set of possible worlds as its semantic interpretant, and implication and incompatibility are determined just the same way that they are in model theory, by inclusion or and disjointness, respectively. So in the model theoretic framework, you're always going to get closed reason relations because you're doing it set theoretically, defining the reason relations from sets of semantic interpretants by inclusion and disjointness. You're going to get monotonic and transitive, that is closed reason relations. But we're going to impose some additional structure on this set of points. The possible worlds come with a structure on them. It's not just a set in the way that at this level of fineness of grain, the model theoretic universe just is a set of points that they call models. And that structure is going to let us distinguish between two classes of vocabulary: the extensional, that's going to be treated the same way model theory does, and intentional vocabulary, which depends on that additional structure that's imposed on the universe of possible worlds. And that further structure is a function that assigns to each possible world a set of possible worlds. Kripke calls that an accessibility relation. Again, it doesn't matter what you call it. Mathematically, he's just added this structure to the set of points that are the universe that gives each point in that universe a neighborhood of the worlds that are accessible to it. Now, on the handout, I remind you that Kripke did all this when he was 16. He submitted it to the Finnish Journal of Philosophy because he figured that was obscure enough that they wouldn't know he was a kid, that the fact they hadn't ever heard of him wouldn't matter to them. You remember the cartoon, the good thing about the internet is no one knows you're a dog. Well, this was the equivalent of that. And he showed how to interpret the additional connectives of modal logic. This was a semantics just for modal logic in terms of that additional structure. So the semantic interpretant of box A, necessarily A, is the set of semantic interpretants that are in the neighborhood of the world where you're assessing it. It's a set of all of those. So you have the set of worlds that's the interpretant of A, and when you're looking at box A, you look at everything that's in the neighborhoods of all of those worlds. For possibly A, diamond A, you look at that same set, but now you look at what's in any of the worlds that are accessible from any of the worlds that are the interpretant of A. And he showed then how you could assign sets of possible worlds as interpretants for modally qualified statements, as well as the rest of them. Now, that would just have been a curiosity in the way that really the two-valued semantics was a curiosity, in that it was just a semantics for classical logic. This was just a semantics for modal logic. One of the interesting things about model theory was, though it was, to begin with, a semantics for logic, it quickly became clear that you could understand the semantics of non-logical extensional vocabulary in model theoretic terms as well. And in what I think of as the second wave of the modal revolution, possible world semantics was extended to do that. This happened in the 70s and 80s. The big players here are Richard Montague, David Lewis, David Kaplan, and Bob Stolnecker. This generalized Kripke's idea by assigning to sentences as their semantic interpretant functions from something to sets of possible worlds. They call that something indices, but it doesn't matter what you call them. What they're looking at is moving from just assigning as a semantic interpretant a set of possible worlds to assigning a function from something to possible worlds. In effect, Kripke's accessibility relation, which was a function from possible worlds to sets of possible worlds, that was the model, the instance that they generalized. So they said, well, but there could be other functions from possible worlds to sets of possible worlds, or functions from who's speaking to a set of possible worlds to interpret words like I, or from a time or a place, here and now. Kaplan was one of the big figures for this. At any rate, the semantic interpretants in the second wave of the modal revolution, instead of just having sets of possible worlds, sets of points from your universe, now you have functions from something to sets of possible worlds. And you redefine implication by saying, well, A implies B in case for every index, every argument value, if you look at the sets of possible worlds that are the values of that function, the set of A worlds is a subset of the set of B worlds. And similarly, you use disjointness of those to define material incompatibility. There was, as I'm sure you're aware, a third wave of the modal revolution. I think of that as metaphysics, as meta-semantics. This is downstream from Kripke's naming a necessity, starting in the 70s. You can think of the analytic metaphysics that, in terms of possible worlds, that was done in this third wave, as concerned with the nature and the structure of the universe from which semantic interpretants are drawn, without worrying about the semantic interpretation that you do with it. I'm not saying that's the way metaphysicians typically think about it, but I would recommend we think about it that way. Now, the fourth structure, okay, and yeah, so this is a more expressively powerful semantic metavocabulary than model theory. Model theory was a semantic metavocabulary that could make sense of the reason relations among extensional base vocabularies. But second wave of possible world semantics shows us how to, it gives us the expressive capacity to specify the meanings of, to specify the reason relations, not only that extensional base vocabularies stand in, but also that intentional ones do. So subjunctive conditionals, for instance, we can now say what their implication and incompatibility relations are. Now, in just the last 5 years, I mean, I was sort of taken aback when I looked, but the index paper by Kit Fine that I put in the supplementary readings, it's only 2017, but it's so evidently greater in expressive power than by now traditional possible world semantics, that this is the preferred framework to be doing this sort of semantics in, and this is the framework that Ulf is going to talk about. But I just wanted to set it out very briefly in the same general terms that I did the others. Here, the universe that you draw from is a set of what he calls states, but it doesn't matter what you call them, they're points. And the additional structure that's on them is not a set theoretic structure, it's a mereological structure. That is, it's a part whole structure. Mereology is, a parallel mathematical structure to set theory. We can talk about what that is more later if you like. But we have a fusion operation which takes two things and forms in the standard interpretation and the intended interpretation, the whole of which those two are parts. In Fine's treatment of this, a further bit of structure is that the states are partitioned into those that are possible and those that are impossible. So it shares with possible worlds the idea that there's many possible worlds, possible states, but part of the additional expressive capacity it's getting is it has many impossible states, whereas possible world semantics just has, well, there's what's possible, and there's the impossible. It's not broken up further. Fine can reconstruct possible world semantics as a special case. Possible worlds are just maximal possible states. That is, states such that fusioning them with anything that isn't already a part of them yields an impossible state. So he has possible world semantics. He can do absolutely everything you can do in possible world semantics, but the states correspond to something like partial possible worlds, if we think about it this way. But as I say, I encourage you to think about it just as points with a structure on it. And in this case, the structure is a mereological structure. And then, and this is a further addition, semantic interpretants drawn from this universe of possible and impossible states with a part whole ordering on them are ordered pairs of sets of states, which Fine thinks of as the truth makers of a sentence and the false makers of it. And some states may be irrelevant to it. They're not either truth makers or false makers. And we're going to use the fusion relations among these. This is bipolar. It's repeating, looking back at that structure of true and false that we saw advantages of in the pragmatic case. He has various ways of defining then the reason relations of implication and incompatibility, but the most straightforward one, the one he usually uses, is that A implies B if all the truth makers of A are truth makers of B, and two things are incompatible if they don't have any truth makers in common. But he's got a lot more structure, and that means you can define reason relations in many different ways. As we'll see, Ulf will say something about this. One measure of the additional expressive power that Fine's truthmaker semantics gives us is that it can not only express the reason relations of extensional vocabulary and intentional vocabulary, but even of hyperintentional vocabulary. It can distinguish the reason relations of logically equivalent sentences. It cuts finer than that. So as I said, these four mathematical approaches to semantics are nested in their expressive capacity. You can see them stretched out over the last 100 years. The one we're working with is the most powerful of those. It's the bright, shiny new toy that we have. Now, Ulf is going to tell us about this. Let me just tell you about him. He's a philosopher with wide and varied interests. while he was still a graduate student at Pitt, with his partner, Katharina Nieswand, who's also a Pitt PhD. He edited and translated the first German edition of G.E.M. Anscombe's, Elizabeth Anscombe's work. He wrote a distinguished 2016 dissertation on the concept of inference. I commend it to your attention. He's always said, from then to now, that his ultimate interest was in the genuinely interesting and hard case of practical reasoning and practical inference, but that he was willing to take the easier, less important, and more tractable case of theoretical reasoning, doxastic reasoning, to try and get straight about that first before moving on to the actually important one. And his efforts thinking about that have secured for him an international reputation as a philosopher of logic, and indeed as a theorem-proving logician. He's one of the best philosophers I know. He's the principal author of the book, Reasons for Logic, Logic for Reasons, that I'm drawing the material from for this course. The principal author of that book. I turn the session over to Wolf.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's hard not to disappoint after that very kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Ulf, and I'm going to, I think maybe change emphasis a little bit, or as we'll tell the story a little bit differently from what you've done so far. Mostly, I think, because it's going to be somewhat more metaphysical in nature. So there will be, as it were, an angle on Aristotle in this at the end that I think probably Bob hasn't talked so much about. But before that, I kind of can just continue where Bob left off with the fine and the Truthmaker stuff. So let me share slides, but maybe before I just put up the slides, my internet connection isn't that great here because I'm on a sabbatical and not where I'm usually at. And I'm happy for you to interrupt me at any point. It just might be that because of a delay, you have to say something or wave or do something, probably all of those things. And then it might take me a while till I really realize that, and we can have a little chat. But I have no problem taking the slides down in between if you have any questions or anything is unclear. All right, so. Can you see those slides? That's the first question.
Yes.
All right, great. So what I'm going to talk about is mostly, so you read, if you did the readings for this week, right? Then you read this two pieces of mine. One is the draft of a chapter and will probably change substantially, but is the thing that I will mostly use for today, and there's behind these slides. And then the other thing is a published piece that is more technical in nature and also connects to some logics that I won't be talking a lot about these days, but today, but that are important for other people for other reasons. Mostly people who worry about semantic paradoxes care about these other logics, but that won't be my topic for today. But the framework and the parallel that I highlight in this piece will be the same. So, does this work? Yeah, I have quite a few slides. The way I first talk a little bit about how I set things up, or kind of how one way into the topic, and then an isomorphism between truthmaker theory and normative bilateralism. And by that, technically, I will think of the normative bilateralism as encoded in sequent calculus. I guess you have looked at sequent calculus a little bit last week, so you have some idea of what I mean, but it won't be that important anyway. And then I will talk a little bit about substructurality, so the openness of reason relations, and then I will turn to more well, metaphysics topics and topics about representation or intentionality in general. And that will bring us back to Aristotle, with whom we also start as an introduction. So maybe you recall that Aristotle has different principles of non-contradiction, and Lukasiewicz distinguishes three kinds of them. I'm happy to just take that over. I think it's a fairly good distinction between those principles of non-contradiction. So there's a logical principle of non-contradiction, which you find in the metaphysics, for example. Opposite assertions cannot be true at the same time. And you have various other formulations of it in Aristotle throughout the corpus. Okay, and now there are two more, and one question is how the three are related. So one more is the metaphysical principle of non-contradiction, which you also get in the metaphysics, all of them actually, but you can also get some of them elsewhere. And the metaphysical principle of non-contradiction reads, it is impossible for the same thing to belong and not to belong at the same time to the same thing and in the same respect. It's pretty specific. It looks like it's a principle about properties or something like that, but I think we could also read it just as a more general and more general principle saying that contradictions are impossible. So there are different ways of reading how narrowly we have to understand the holding of something here. But okay, let's forget about that. Then there's a psychological principle of non-contradiction, and that says it's impossible to hold or suppose. The Greek word there, I think, is something that is sometimes translated as belief and sometimes translated as suppose, the same thing to be and not to be. Now, several people have pointed out that might be problematic. For example, you might think, I can hold or suppose anything I like, even a contradiction. There's no problem there. Be that as it may, there's a debate to be had there. But I think one thing that seems pretty solid is to say, well, at least you shouldn't if you're rational, or insofar as your reason, your mental capacities, your rational mental capacities are working properly, you don't hold the same thing to be and not to be at the same time. Okay. So the question is, how are those related? How is the metaphysical principle and the psychological related, and how are both of them related to the logical principle of contradiction? And what I want to suggest is that it is fruitful to think that the logical principle of non-contradiction is somehow getting at the same root for the other ones. Is that in some sense the primary, or the one that is behind both of them, the metaphysical and the psychological. But it is important and fruitful to see the metaphysical and the psychological principle of non-contradiction as two ways in which this logical principle can manifest or realize itself. The way I will put this later on is to say that we should think of reason relations, and that includes a special case of logical reason relations. For a lot of what I will say today actually doesn't make that much of a difference. We can talk more about this, but specifically logical reason relations if you want. But anyway, I think that we should think of those reason relations as informing both kinds of matter, as it were, the world, states, and the mind, or discursive acts. So I think there is a benefit from thinking of the logical as the basis behind the metaphysical and the psychological, and the metaphysical and the psychological as two sides of the same coin, the coin being the logical at root. Okay, with that introduction, I want to talk about four things. So first, explain the isomorphism that I already hinted at, and then the substructurality. So what the isomorphism will turn out to be is that there's a way of looking at normative bilateralism, and I'll explain in a minute what that is, even though you probably already talked about that, and exact truthmaker theory. And substructurality, I will point out that these frameworks have the ability to codify open reason relations. So reason relations that are non-monotonic and non-transitive. And then I will talk about bimodal holomorphic conceptual realism, which is a term that Bob created and meant something by it that is very similar, but not exactly the same that I will mean by it. So there will be a question of I will try to give you the updated version, the version that I really like of that same idea, what I take to be the same idea. And then I will end with an Aristotelian thought about intentionality and how discursive acts might be taken to picture or represent creativity. So on to the isomorphism. A little bit of recap on normative bilateralism. So normative bilateralism, I take that there are different versions of that. There's a version that is due to Rumford and others, but the version that will matter for me is the version that was developed by Restall, and then Ripley, a student of Restall, has developed that further and has pushed that idea. And it says that what it means for gamma to imply delta, where those are sets of sentences or sets of, it doesn't, we'll take them to be sentences. This is actually, we can talk about this more, but it won't matter for now. So that asserting everything in gamma and denying everything in delta is out of bounds. And what they mean by out of bounds is that it's violating in norms of coherence. That's what it means for gamma to imply delta. Now, what follows from what that means is a matter of the discursive norms governing our speech acts, governing assertions and denials, right? Those are just two ways of saying the same thing. What follows from what, and which collections of assertions and denials are out of bounds are saying the same thing in two different guises. That's why what follows from what is a matter of those discursive norms. And since meanings are determined or are a matter of what follows from what, meanings are then also, I will just presuppose that, right? If you have any inferentialist sympathies, you will think that meanings are a matter of what follows from what. And so it follows that meanings on this view are a matter of these discursive norms. The particular logical implication relation is then just what follows from what in virtue of logical form, where we can understand that as saying, well, what is such that it follows from something else, even if we replace non-logical vocabulary for non-logical vocabulary in any way we like. And that gives us an immediate normative reading of sequent calculi, right? If you have a sequent calculus, you can think of that as just telling you that all such and such positions are out of bounds. That might be an axiom, and then a sequent rule tells you if these positions are out of bounds and these other positions are out of bounds, then this third kind of position is out of bounds, or something like that, depending on how many premise sequence you have in the sequent rule. Bob and Ryan Simonelli have suggested that this can also be put in a different way, namely by saying that what it means for gamma to imply delta is that commitment to accept everything in gamma precludes entitlement to reject everything in delta. I think there are important questions about the extra structure you get from this and how much more it might give you than just the way that Ristall formulates things. But for what I will say today, it doesn't actually matter. So we can take either of those and it will be fine. I will usually just talk Ristall talk today because it's very easy in many ways. Just it's very convenient to talk out of bounds. Okay. So now Truthmaker theory. I assume that you heard already something about normative bilateralism and Ristall's position, but that what you just heard from Bob is your first introduction to Fine's exact Truthmaker theory. So I will spend some time of walking you through that, at least the basics. I try to keep everything as non-technical as I can, and I think I can do most of what I want to say. It doesn't really require the technical machinery. But to understand Truthmaker theory, there's a little bit of technical machinery you have to at least get on the table to see how this works. Nevertheless, there are basic ideas that I take to be really non-technical. So there are some basic metaphysical ideas, and one of them I take to be that there are states, and some of the states obtain. There are lots of states. There are lots of states that don't obtain. You know, like the state of me being King of England is a state. It's a perfectly good state. It's even a possible state, I take it. I hope at least, but it's not an actual state, right? And then some states obtain and others don't. That difference won't matter in what follows. But of course, it is a difference that matters to most of us in everyday life. What is the case and what is not the case matters. So, and you can then think of reality as just constituted by states. You have a lot of states. The sun is shining. I don't know. Picasso was a painter and so forth, all states, and together they make up the world. Now, some states are parts of other states. That's the mereological structure that Bob mentioned a minute ago. And then also something Bob already mentioned, some states are possible and other states are impossible. That's our basic view in Truthmaker theory about states. And then there are some semantic ideas. So sentences are made true or false by states. If you say that Picasso was a Spanish painter, then that's true, and that's true in virtue of a worldly state, namely the state of Picasso being a Spanish painter. That's what makes that sentence true. When you say that Wittgenstein was French, then that's false, and that's made false by some state. Now, here it's tricky which state that actually is. There are different options. Some people think that it's the state of him being Austrian, and that no one can be Austrian or French, or at least, him being only Austrian. I mean, he sometimes called himself German, but forget about that, right? This is a political issue, but pretty clear that he's not French. So some people think it's his being Austrian or only Austrian. Some people think it's more something like, oh, the totality of all the states that make up the world don't include a state of Wittgenstein being French, and it's that makes it false that Wittgenstein was French. Maybe there's something else. There could also be just a negative fact, so kind of a fact of him being non-French, like the state, a worldly state of Wittgenstein being non-French. Maybe that's the falsity maker of Wittgenstein was French. But I will just assume that there's some view here that is right? Whatever you think about what makes it false that Wittgenstein was French, you can plug that in here, and it won't matter that much what you think. But it is an interesting question what you think about that. Actually, there's a fun debate between Russell and one of his students. I think pretty early when Russell started to teach in the US. After he moved over from England, he had a debate with one of his students whether you need negative states and so forth. Second idea, the meaning of a sentence are the states that make it true or false. Put differently, if you want to know what a sentence means, you were told everything you need to know by being told which states make it true and which states make it false. Of course, also knowing that those are all the states that make it true and all states that make it false. And then third, truth makers and falsity makers are wholly relevant to the sentence. So the example that Fine always uses is that the state of it being cold makes a sentence that's cold true. But the state of it being cold and rainy is not an exact truth maker of its cold, because it includes a part that is irrelevant. The bit about rain is not relevant, so it's not wholly relevant. The state is not wholly relevant to the truth of the sentence, and that's why it's not an exact truth maker. He sometimes calls it a loose truth maker. He sometimes calls it an inexact truth maker, and sometimes these things can do useful work. They won't do any work for us, so we can just you can define them, of course, in terms of exact truth makers, but we won't need that. Okay, and now come the little bit technical bits here. So one way to set up formal machinery in that spirit of truth makers is to start with a modalized state space. Modalized state space is a triple, so it has a set S of states. Again, I could repeat what Bob stressed several times before, that it actually doesn't matter what you call them, right? Here, mathematically, they're just any points will do. Then there is a subset of them. Those are the possible states. Then I will try to keep up this interpretation that will become relevant for me, so that we do mean states and possible states, at least for now. Okay. And then there's a relation that is the square kind of angularly subset relation there, and that's parted. So one state being part of another. And there's an empty state. Actually, this can fall out automatically, the empty state, but I think it's good to mention it, that you have an empty state. Empty state is part of every other state. This is where the nothing state, it's the minimum to which you default. Nothing else is going on. And we can fuse states. The way that Fine does it is to say that fusion is the least upper bound of the partial order of the parted relation. And that has advantages, but one way to think about it is just that you can combine states into larger states. And then what happens is that the states that you combine in order to get a larger state are parts of the states that you get in this way. Find and often distinguishes, sorry, I should say now, one thing that I did not do so far is tell you anything about the possible states, right? The possible states could be any subset of the states. And you might think that very low. Fine imposes restrictions on what states can be possible. And here are the 3 restrictions that he typically imposes when he talks about that. Actually, I should also mention that Fine often doesn't even make the distinction between possible and impossible states. He loves to be able to do things without that distinction as far as possible, and then introduces it very late in the game. Only when he wants to talk about modal logic or things like that. So only when he thinks there's some intuitive pull for him to bring in modality, he does that. This will be one of the differences. That for me, this is part of the very bedrock of this whole thing, that we introduce this distinction at the start. Anyway, so we have downward closure, and what downward closure is telling you, so just reading what it says, unpacking the technical notation that I have behind downward closure here, is that if S is a possible state, right? S is a member of the set of possible states, that's S with big S with a diamond. And T is a part of S. This other state T is a part of the state S, then T is also possible. So what it says is that if you have a possible state, all of its parts are also possible. Every state that is included in that state as a part is by itself also possible. Then you have exclusivity, and exclusivity says that this is actually not exactly Fine's formulation. I'll talk about that in a minute, but let me first read that to you and then point out the difference. If you take a truth maker of S, of P. So you take a sentence P and let it be an atomic sentence. It won't matter actually that whether this is atomic at the end of the day, but let it be an atomic sentence. And you take a truth maker of that. So S is a truth maker of P, and I write this as kind of this evaluation strokes around P, and the plus means it's a truth maker. So it's kind of the interpretation of P and the positive interpretation. So if S is a truth maker of P and T is a falsity maker of P, same P, again, the evaluation strokes, and then S for it's a falsity maker of it. Then whenever you fuse them together and you add perhaps nothing, perhaps some other states, you always get an impossible state. You always get a state that is not a member of the possible states, which means that it's impossible. There are only possible and impossible ones. There isn't any third category. Every state that isn't possible is therefore impossible. Now, the difference between that and Fine's usual formulation is that I now added this. You can fuse any other state U with that, and it will still be impossible. given downward closure, these things don't differ. They amount to the same. But it's more convenient to me to say it this way because that maps more easily onto one of the rules, the sequence rules that I like. Okay, and then there's exhaustivity. And exhaustivity says that if you have a possible state, so U is a possible state, and then you have an atomic sentence P, you can either take a truth maker of P and fuse it with this possible state, and you get a possible state, or you can take a falsity maker of P, fuse it with this possible state, and get another possible state. What that means basically is that if you have a possible state, you can always extend it with some stance you want to take on any other matter, like P. So the question, if the question is whether P, and you already have a possible state, you can come down one or the other way on P. Either you can make it true or you can make it false. It can't happen that you can make neither, that you will end up in trouble, meaning end up with an impossible state or whatever you do. That's ruled out by exhaustivity. These things will become important in a minute because a big part of what I claim to be the big revelation in this isomorphism consists in the fact that these are equivalent to 3 traditional structural rules. Okay, just to finish things up, I already used this 2 lines as an evaluation function. To bring this in explicitly, we can define models, and then a model is a model as state space. So S, and then this set of states, the subset of states that are possible, the parted relation, and then this evaluation function. An evaluation function for a sentence takes that sentence and returns a pair, namely the pair of its truth makers and the pair of its, the set of its truth makers, and the second member of the pair is the set of its falsity makers. That's just what this means, is Cartesian product of power sets. Nothing to worry about. To get logic out of this, we introduce logical vocabulary. We have semantic clauses for logical vocabulary. And the truth makers and falsity makers of atomic sentences are given by the model immediately. And then we extend the model to give us truth makers and falsity makers for logically complex sentences. And those are the clauses for them. So let me read those to you so that you can follow what those things mean. So the first, atom plus and atom minus, just means that S is a truth. So this funny turnstile with the 2 vertical lines means the state to the left is a truth maker, or if it's reversed, falsity maker of the sentence to the right. So the first clause here, atom plus, reads S is a truth maker of the sentence P if and only if S is a member of the truth makers of P that are given in the model immediately. The second clause reads S is a falsity maker of the sentence P if and only if S is a member of the falsity makers of P. So that's trivial, right? It just reads out the model. But now come as about the logical bits, where logical vocabulary is treated. And negation is treated by just flipping. So a state makes the negation true just in case it makes the negatum false. So the sentence, if you want to know which states make the sentence I'm not American true, you have to think about which states make it false that I'm American. That's how this will work. And it also works the other way around. If you want to say which states make it false that I'm not German, then those will be the states that make it the case that I am German. So basically just flipping, right? Truth makers and falsity makers are flipped by negation. For the conjunction, you have a state S makes the conjunction B and C true if and only if there are 2 states, U and T, such that one is a truth maker of the first conjunct, the second is a truth maker of the second conjunct, and the state that you're trying to evaluate is the fusion of those 2 states. So S is a fusion of U and T. And something makes a conjunction false if it makes one of its conjuncts false. And then you have the dual for disjunction. So something makes a state, makes a disjunction true if it makes one of its disjuncts true, and it makes a disjunction false if there is a state. There's a fusion of falsity makers for both of the disjuncts. All right. And then I've already mentioned this. Find has different notions of consequence that he defines with this in place. So one is entailment. P entails Q if and only if every verifier, so every truth maker. Verifiers and truth makers are the same thing. Falsifiers, falsity makers, same thing, just different words for the same thing. Because sometimes it's easier to write one than the other. So every verifier of P is a verifier of Q, every truth maker of P is a truth maker of Q. And then there's containment. Containment is a bit complex. He often says that Q contains P if every verifier of Q includes a verifier as a part of verifier of P, and every verifier of P is included in the verifier of Q. That sounds complicated, but it gives him certain nice relations that he wants for certain reasons. So he's a fan of that kind of thing. I think it's very natural. I think many other people think it's not very natural. It's a different issue. Once you do all that, you might think that it looks a whole lot just like classical logic, and it certainly does in many respects, but it is more powerful in many ways. And if one works it in the right way, one can get a lot out of this. And one way to see that is to see that the theory is hyperintentional. And two ways in which you can see that, or two things that you can actually mean by something being hyperintentional, is whether two necessary sentences can be distinguished in their meaning or their implications, and whether two logically equivalent propositions can be distinguished. By logical equivalent here, I just mean classical logically equivalent. One, because if you make the truth maker equivalent, then depending on what you mean by truth maker consequence, you can of course cut fine enough that this requires them to be identical. One way to see this is to look at the distribution law. So for example, disjunction distributes over conjunction classically. And if you want a case, here's a case on the slide. P or Q and R is logically equivalent to P or Q and P or R. If you think about it, the first one says that either P or this conjunction, and if P is the case, then both of the conjuncts on the other side are true. And if the other thing is the case, then again, the first part of the conjunction on the left makes the left conjunct on the right true, and the second part makes the second. So those always come together in classical logic, but you can get them apart in truth maker theory. If you have if you have exact truth makers of P and of Q, and you fuse them, that will always be a truth maker for the second, but not necessarily for the first. It will be a truth maker for the second, because remember that a truth maker of a conjunction is a truth maker of one conjunct, the first conjunct, fused with a truth maker of the second conjunct. And a truth maker for disjunction is something that makes one of those things true. So P is a truth maker of the first disjunction of the second sentence. And Q is a truth maker, sorry, the other way around. Q is a truth maker, I should have taken R. Q is a truth maker of the first conjunct, and P is a truth maker of the second conjunct. So the whole thing is a truth maker of the second sentence. But it's not the case for the first, because for the first, the truth maker is either a truth maker for P or a truth maker of the conjunction of Q and R. But a fusion of an exact truth maker of P and an exact truth maker of Q need not be either of those things. Need not be an exact truth maker of P because it includes this part Q, and need not be an exact truth maker of Q and R because it doesn't say anything about R. would be just luck if it also made R true. Okay, so you can work through the example, but you can also just believe me that it can get those things apart if you look at it long enough. You will realize that you find a way to bring those apart. And another way of seeing this, which might be more intuitive, is just to think that this is a framework on which things have truth makers, and those are particular states. So for example, you can think maybe there's more going on metaphysically below this, but you can think that 3 being prime, the sentence 3 is prime is made true by the fact that 3 is prime. And the sentence 5 is prime is made true by the fact that 5 is prime, the state of 5 being prime. As long as the state of 3 being prime and 5 being prime are not identical, the sentences 3 is prime and 5 are prime will have distinct truth makers, even though they're both necessary. Right? So you can bring apart necessary propositions, so necessary equivalent propositions, either things that are themselves necessary and therefore also necessary equivalent, or just necessary propositions. And the way to do it is just to think that each of them has their own truth makers and their own falsity makers. And those need not be identical, even if every possible world includes both of them, right? That doesn't mean that they're the same states. And the trick with the distribution law is basically the same in disguise. You have to fiddle around. Okay, let's have intentionality. I think this will be the last slide, and then I think maybe a break after that. Maybe a little bit, give you opportunity to ask questions, and then we'll take a break. That will be a good point. So, but before that, the idea. So the idea that is driving part of our joint project for the book. At least one chapter of it, the chapter of which you wrote, read a draft, is to say that there is something that you might call Truthmaker bilateralism. Sometimes I just call it Truthmaker consequence, Truthmaker validity, different names for that. But it's a definition of consequence in the Truthmaker framework. And it's a definition of consequence that differs from the definition of consequence you get in find. Remember that find typically doesn't want the notion of possibility and impossibility, so possible and impossible states, to play any role in its definitions of consequence. He just says if every truth maker of the premises is a truth maker of the conclusions, or if there's some complicated inclusion relations between those, then he will say one follows from the other in some sense. Now, I'm thinking we can have an analog of something like the Blaistall-Ripley normative bilateralism in truthmaker theory if we don't do that. If we build in possibility and impossibility into the very definition of consequence. So let me remind you, normative bilateralism is gamma implies delta if and only if it's out of bounds, to assert all the members of gamma and deny all the members of delta. And now I want to say, look, asserting is a lot like making true, denying is a lot like making false, being out of bounds is a lot like being impossible. And once you slot in those translations, the result you get is this. So I have TM for truthmaker, that's the subscript here. So gamma, truthmaker implies delta, if and only if. Any fusion of verifiers for all the things in gamma and falsifiers for all the things in delta is an impossible state. And then I say the same thing again on the slide in technical notation, but it's the same thing. So the idea is we can mirror the normative bilateralism in truthmaker theory and get a very similar notion back. It is fundamentally total in its character, this definition of consequence. I don't think that's a problem. Now, Fine doesn't like that for because he has the idea of being very pristine in certain ways, which he thinks of kind of pure. But I think there's precedent, for example, on other sides of thinking of logical consequence and this is not just logical, but it's mostly a matter of logical consequence in the literature, as fundamentally modal. One thing you can notice is that lots of people have wondered what the logical must is, like the hardness of the logical must, and then people have wondered, what is this modal element? And people try to capture that in different ways. For example, Etchemendy in the book that Bob mentioned some time ago today also wonders what is the right way to capture the modal force of consequence. And there's some people like Bueno and Tchaikovsky have a view that they call modalism that says, no, we want to define what follows from what immediately in modal terms, and they say what it means for A to imply B is for it to be impossible, that A and not B is impossible. And this view, this Truthmaker bilateralism, is in the same ballpark as these views, right? It's in the same ballpark and saying something fundamentally modal about consequence, and what that modality is a ruling out of all the premises holding and the conclusions being all false. The conclusions all failing. That's ruled out by a consequence. All right. Sorry, I misadvertised the previous slide as the last slide. There's one more slide. So once you do all this, there's the isomorphism that emerges that I want to claim is important, illuminating, and philosophically relevant. And here's the isomorphism. So the first thing that you get is that weakening and downward closure become the same. So weakening, the principle that you can add premises or conclusions actually to a valid inference and it stays valid. Once you work through the definitions that I just gave you, it's not hard to see that this is the same as downward closure, because, you know, if a state is impossible, all things of which it's part are also impossible. So if the fusion of the truth makers of premises and conclusion and the falsity makers of conclusion is an impossible state, everything of which this is a part is also impossible. And just adding premises and conclusions will just give you states that of which the initial state is a part. Cut is
weakening is
exclusivity.
monotonicity.
Oh yes, yes. Weakening, also known as monotonicity or thinning, or a bunch of other names that you cut, so transitivity, cut is transitivity, or there are different versions of cut, capture different versions of transitivity or generalizations of transitivity, and that turns out to be exclusivity. So the principle that you can extend every possible state either with a truth maker or falsity maker with any sentence you choose is identical to cut or equivalent to cut. One way to see that is to think that if you have a sequence that is valid, so a valid inference, say from gamma to delta, then that means that that state is impossible, right? Now, suppose that this thing is actually invalid. That means that that state is, there's at least one possible state like that, right? Now, if you read cut contrapositively, what cut tells you is that if a sequence doesn't hold, then one of the two top sequences of cut must not hold, right? So if gamma turns out delta doesn't hold, then either gamma turns out delta p doesn't hold, or p gamma turns out delta doesn't hold, which are the two top sequences of it, an additive version of cut. And now you can turn this into a principle about truth makers with the translation, saying that if there is a possible state, then there must be either a possible state in which you add a truth maker of P or a possible state in which there's a falsity maker of P. And that's just the formulation of exclusivity if you look at it again. And identity or reflexivity, so the principle that everything implies itself, that can occur with arbitrary context added or without arbitrary contexts. Sometimes when there are arbitrary contexts, it's called containment. That turns out to be, in truthmaker theory, that turns out to be inclusivity once we read consequence in this way just suggested. For the operational rules, it turns out that right rules are equivalent to the clauses for truth makers, and left rules, sorry, I got this the wrong way around. Switch this. The left rules are the ones for truth makers, the right rules are the ones for falsity makers, because the premises are encoded in truth makers, the conclusions are encoded in falsity makers. Sorry about that, that's a typo. Now, once you have these equivalences, one thing you can do is just move back and forth. So suppose you have a view about the norms of discourse, meaning that you have a view about which collections of assertions and denials are ruled out by the norms that you think are the relevant norms for logic or for meaning or for rationality or what have you. I don't actually care at this point. Then this gives you a way to construct a sequence calculus for this. What you have to do is, you think that you have these norms, and I suppose that you think that you have a sequence calculus that encodes those norms in the right way. And then what you do is just you add the rules that you want, right? You add exclusivity if you want this to be transitive, you add downward closure if you want it to be monotonic and so forth, and you read off the truth maker clauses from your left and right rules in the right way. So you read off the truth maker clauses from your left rules and the falsity maker clause from your right rules. And that gives you a truth maker theory that encodes the same norms that you said are essential for discourse. And you can go the other way around. If you think I have a view about which states are impossible relative to being truth makers and falsity makers of sentences, then you can turn that into a sequence calculus and therefore read this also in a normative way, in the way in which I illustrated at the start, just going the other direction. Okay, I think now is a good time.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I have a question on the Truthmaker bilateralism. It seems like the correspondence was possible partly because the basic element of two structure, Richter-Ripley bilateralism and Truthmaker theory are parallel. The fifth act of assertion and denial is parallel to Truthmaker and Versemaker. But I was wondering if we want to accept Brandom and Simonelli's bilateralism, that we have one more element, entitlement. And I was wondering how we can connect this bilateralism with entitlement to Truthmaker theory. So there is any element in Truthmaker theory that corresponds to entitlement?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is not clear. Sorry.
Well, my view about that is that where Richter-Ripley bilateralism is just using this one notion of being inbounds or out of bounds, appropriate or inappropriate, okay or not okay, we're looking at commitments that you can be entitled to or not. Their out of bounds is having a set of commitments that you can't be entitled to. So we can reconstruct that notion of out of boundness in the Brandom-Simonelli structure as just saying, well, that's a set of commitments to accept all the premises and reject all the conclusions. That's a set of commitments you can't be entitled to. They say what you can't be entitled to is out of bounds. But as we've seen, there's an advantage to the more expressively fine-grained keeping track of commitments and entitlements. But you can say in those terms everything that Restall and Ripley need. To say a set of commitments to accept and reject is out of bounds is just saying you can't be entitled to all those commitments.
Maybe one thing that we can add is that there might be more going on in the normative domain than what is captured by Truthmaker theory in this version, right? So there might be, because one way to understand, given what Bob just said, one way to rephrase a question, right, is to say, okay, Bob, you tell me that the out-of-boundness can be explained in terms of entitlement and commitment. Right? So that if you're committed to accept everything in the premises, then you're precluded from being entitled to reject all of the things in the conclusion. And that's just an explanation of what all out-of-boundness is for Aristotle and Ripley. So, but at that point, you might ask, but is there a similar translation back from impossibility in the elitic case, so that the fusion being impossible can be, somehow explained in other modal terms? Like, and I think that's an interesting question that I have suspicions about, but I don't have an answer, I think, to whether this is possible, and if so, how. One thing that I think I would point to in this respect is Fine has a paper on counterfactual conditionals, and he thinks that truthmaker theory can help one with counterfactual conditionals. And I think, so one thing that he does there is to say, is the idea that if you add a truthmaker to something, it leads to something else. That's how he wants to understand the counterfactual conditional. I'm wondering whether there's a connection. I'm wondering whether there's something about how the states really are combined, rather than just whether they're possible and impossible overall. That is similar to how entitlement and commitment combine, relate states in a more tight fashion, or in a more detailed fashion, than just saying whether they're inbounds or out of bounds, where the collection of them, right? The collection of the discursive acts is inbounds or out of bounds. But that's speculation, pure speculation.
Okay, thank you.
This is a good place for us to break. When we come back at 2:38, Ulf will tell us more about this isomorphism between the pragmatic way, between pragmatic metavocabularies and truthmaker semantic metavocabularies that's established through the reason relations if you use his notion of consequence that he just put on the table.
Okay, great. So I hope what I've done now is introduce you to the basics of truthmaker theory and explain to you that this corresponds to normative bilateralism as you would encode it usually in a sequent calculus, so that there's an immediate correspondence between the immediate, more or less immediate, I mean immediate once you see it, correspondence between truthmaker theory if we understand consequence in the way in which I suggested, so that delta follows from gamma if and only if. Whenever you fuse truth makers for each of the sentences in gamma with falsity makers for each of the sentences in delta, you get an impossible state. If you understand consequence in this way, there is this correspondence between that framework and the sequent calculus, and the sequent calculus has an immediate interpretation in terms of normative bilateralism. Right? You can just read that as a formulation of your normative bilateralist theory, if you like. The equivalence or the correspondence here translates different elements into different other elements, and the hope is that those translations make sense bit by bit, not just as it were globally, because it gives you the right result once you do all the things, but also each of the parts. So the truth making and asserting somehow this mapping makes sense, false making and denying, and being ruled out alethically as in a possible state, and being ruled out normatively as not to be taken up position, or a collection of assertion and denials to which you cannot be entitled, something along those lines. Okay, now so far I haven't talked at all about, well, I have talked about the structural principles, but I haven't told you what happens when you leave them out. Now, in some senses, it shouldn't be a mystery because you've already looked at some frameworks in the last couple of weeks where we leave out structural principles in sequent calculus, and you know what the result there is. And in some sense, there's no surprise here. It's just the same result because the sequent calculus and the Truthmaker theory correspond to one another, so you get the same result. But I think it is remarkable and noteworthy that this works, that you can adjust as the Truthmaker theory in these ways. You can tweak it in the exact same ways, and the isomorphism between the two theories remains. So that's what I want to talk about now. Start sharing the slides again. Substructurality. Okay. One way to think about it is in terms of logics. I mean, you care about logics for the seminar, and of course they are the case that are most easily studied, and there's lots of other interesting things to say about the role of logical vocabulary. But right now for me, it's just a test case because it's easy to find logics in the literature. There are lots of them, and they're all very well studied, or not all of them, but the clear ways of studying them. So one thing to notice is that the easiest case is classical logic, and what happens is if you insist on the structural principles in the sequent calculus, and you also think that the only axioms are axioms of reflexivity or containment, so that something implies itself, that's the only axiom, and then everything else is done by the sequent rules, then you get classical logic. And in the same way, you get classical logic in Truthmaker theory if you impose exclusivity, and Dauer closure, and you say that really it's exclusivity that gives you all of the principles about what are impossible states. So if a state is impossible, it's necessarily impossible given exclusivity, and then you get classical logic. Another way of doing it is, of course, just to quantify over all the models and say exclusivity holds in all models and everything else varies. But you get the same effect. You get a mapping of Truthmaker theory and classical logic. Now, once you stay at the level, if you stay at the level of logic and say you don't care about material implications, you can also now reject structural principles one by one, as it were. And one thing to do is to reject just exclusivity that corresponds to cut. Now, one thing, if you just do that, nothing happens. That's a good thing too, because cut can be eliminated from a usual sequent calculus, right? So cut is redundant, and in the same way, exclusivity is redundant. But one thing that has been discovered in recent years is that if you now add a transparent truth predicate, so a truth predicate that applies to all the sentences in a language, including sentences that include itself. So, for example, paradigmatically, the liar sentence, this very sentence is false. Then this logic still works, and it still includes all classical implications. All classically valid inferences are still valid, but cut starts to fade. That's the view that Dave Ripley pushes as a response to the paradoxes. And it's called ST for strict tolerant logic in the literature. And if you reject exclusivity in the Truthmaker theory, you get just that logic ST, which without a truth predicate is just classical logic, but with a truth predicate starts to be really different. Because with a transparent truth predicate, classical logic is just trivial. It's everything flows from everything else. The kind of flip side, there's a complicated relation. It's not a dual, but it's something like a dual. People their papers trying to find a better name for that and try to study the phenomenon in more detail. But there's a logic that corresponds in an interesting way to ST. It's called TS. And what that logic does is it keeps transitivity, so it keeps cut, but it rejects reflexivity as a solution to the semantic paradox. So, for example, Rohan French pushes this as a potential solution to the semantic paradoxes. And you get that logic just by, in the Truthmaker theory, just by rejecting exclusivity, keeping exclusivity in downward closure, adding a transparent truth predicate, and everything works just as usual. So what this shows is that the way in which we map Truthmaker theory into a sequence calculus keeps up under, as it were, the perturbations of your sequence calculus that you might be tempted to do given problematic cases like the liar sentence or things like that. Moreover, those things are usually done in a three-valued semantics nowadays. Sometimes four-valued if you want to do several things at once. But from Truthmaker theory, now this starts to look like a very special and very kind of odd way of doing this, the semantics. It basically just groups together possible and impossible states in a certain way that seems very nice in some sense technically, because it's easy, it groups lots of things together and kind of erases differences between them. But it also seems, you know, just like a nice simplification to have just these three truth values instead of all the states around. One way to see that is that you can do this with the three-valued semantics. You can easily do ST and TS. So you can reject exclusivity and exclusivity. One of them, if you want, if you like. But downward closure is a hard thing. Downward closure in a rejecting, so meaning monotonicity, rejecting monotonicity in a three-valued semantics is not an easy thing. Typically, you have to add extra machinery on top of whatever you have. For example, you might have a partial order over your models and read out only the minimal ones. There are known techniques for doing that. You don't have to care about that. I can tell you it's not a straightforward thing. It's possible, but it's a very extra thing that you need to do on top of that. Whereas if you do the whole thing in Truthmaker theory, you don't have to change anything in your semantics. All you have to do is reject downward closure, and the result will be non-monotonic. So let me tell you about that. I guess that you by now know how Bob and Dan and I tend to do non-monotonic logic with base relations. So non-monotonic consequence relations, I should say. Then the logic is a special part of that. But so, and we care about open material reason relations, by which we mean relations of sentences implying each other, not necessarily logical. So might have to do with the content, you know, like it's blue implies it's colored, it's a mammal implies it has hair, things like that. Maybe, maybe not. We can take individual cases, but that's not the important part. And we think that those relations are open, and that means substructural. In particular, what we mean by that is typically that they are non-monotonic and non-transitive. And the way we do it in the sequence calculus is usually we say, well, the basic relations are the ones among atomic sentences. And there we just take this relation as given by the meanings of the atomic sentences. It has to do with the meaning of its colored, that it is implied by its red. And this is where the starting material when we do logic. We take that, sometimes we call it a base relation or a base, let it be B, this German B. This is a set of sequence among atomic sentences. We close that under Ketten and style sequence rules. And if E base containment, which is the principle that if gamma and delta share some sentence, so if some sentences on both sides of the turnstile, then nothing follows. If all of those are in there, then the result is supraclassical, in the sense that every classically valid inference propositionally classically valid inference is part of the resultant consequence relation. So you get all of classical logic back, plus the material information that you're stuck in. Now, what corresponds to that in Truthmaker theory? In Truthmaker theory, what you do is you require of all models that for all of your base sequence, right, all the fusions of verifiers and of the premises and falsifiers of the conclusions are impossible states. That just corresponds to taking the base sequence, right? Making sure that all the base sequences are valid. One other way of saying that is, for example, if you want that it's red implies that it's colored, then whenever you have a state that makes its red true and its colored false, and you fuse them, that fusion has to be impossible. We say it's not possible to combine a state of it's red and the state that makes it false, so it's colored. It's an impossible state. Okay, and once you have those, then you just go through the semantic clauses for truth makers and falsity makers, and that assigns truth makers and falsity makers to all logically complex sentences. And if your base or base containment, which in this case is exclusivity, if we state it immediately in Truthmaker theory, the resulting consequence relation is against classical. And it's actually the exact same consequence relation, right? So I write this like this, where non-monotonic logic, sequence calculus is with the wavy turnstile for the base B is the same as the Truthmaker theory for that over the base, same base B. They always go together, which means that for us, it's not only the case that this analogy between the sequence calculus and the Truthmaker theory holds in classical logic and in ST and in TS, but also if we add in material implications and non-monotonic, non-transitive material implications, it still goes through just fine. Nothing needs to be done, basically. Just have to crank through.
And let me mention, because Ulf won't, that this is all his work. Kit Fine did not explore substructural Truthmaker relations. The large number of people working in the Truthmaker framework have not been exploring non-monotonic, non-transitive schemes. They didn't see how to do it. Ulf is the one who showed using Dan's work in non-monotonic sequence calculus, showed, given this isomorphism, how to translate this into the Truthmaker framework. So quite apart from the concerns we have about the isomorphism with the pragmatic metavocabularies that we're concerned with, this is a huge advance just within Truthmaker semantics that Ulf has produced.
Thank you so much. That's a nice compliment. Maybe one thing that one can say in defense of the people who worked on that before is that they tended to follow Fine in not trying to not bring in modality at the start. And I think that's what did a lot. I mean, that's what allows me to do all of this. And I think it's a bad idea to try to push modality so far back. Fine thinks that's important. So there's, I think, some kind of difference of approach there that explains some of this. It also explains why they did have some logics that are technically substructural. Like, for example, there is a known Truthmaker semantics for the logic R, but they are nowhere, they're not in the ballpark of the kind of logics that I'm treating here. You can get them without the modality, and they have very different properties in many respects. So,
and the key to it is the definition of implication of the consequence relation, modeling that on the Restall-Ripley one. That's what makes it all work.
Yeah, that's Okay, so now I take myself to have given you the formal framework and the correspondence between the formal framework and how it works even in the substructural case. There are lots of technical details we could go into, and if you want, ask me about them. I hope I still remember all of the technical details from the time I worked through all of that. But I want to push on to more philosophical, a philosophical interpretation of what that tells us, why this is actually philosophically important. So feel free to stop me if you want to, but if not, I move on to functionalism about content. So one thing that Bob and Dan and I agree on, I think, is some sort of functionalism about content. So what that means is to have a particular content, we think, is to play a certain role with respect to other content. And one classic paper in this respect is Sellers' paper, meaning is functional role. Bob, you correct me if I'm misquoting the title. So this is a version of the same thought that Sellers has there. Sellers introduces dot quotes, I think, in that paper, maybe in another one, but it's the same idea as with the dot quotes, that you have what it is for a word. Now, in our case, it will be sentences, mostly because we only look at the level of sentences, but what it means for an expression, like a sentence or word, to mean something is to play a certain role with respect to other meaningful items. And that also means that such roles can be realized in different ways and can be still the same role, right? Things can play the same role. For example, different inscriptions or speech acts or thoughts might all play the same role. That's why a thought might have the same content as a speech act or inscription, because it plays the same functional role relative to the other thoughts, inscriptions, speech acts. Or even that we can have different languages, right? With the dot quotes, one thing that Sellers did with the dot quotes is to say, when you dot quote an expression in English, it picks out the functional role that this expression shares with its translations in other languages. So that, I think his example was often und in German and in English mean the same thing, and what it means is that they have the same function. Now, I want to say, and wealthy states can also play the same role. That might be strange, and that will be what I will try to explain. But first, why modal functionalism? Well, the question then is, once you're there with the functionalism, when you take the functionalism about content on board, the question is, what do you mean by role? What is this role that you think content is essentially? And the answer, I think, has to include that the role is one of ruling out or ruling in. Doesn't really matter so much what you call that, but it has to have modal oomph, in the sense that the contentful item must be able to clash with other contentful items in the right way. Must be able to rule them out, to be incompatible with them. If that's not the case, I don't know how that should be a contentful item. And moreover, such a clash, I think, must be essential and built into the nature of the thing you're dealing with, in a certain way. At least individuated by it being a contentful item. That's, you can't bring that in later. That has to be there at the start. That's just the kind of thing it is to play a role in this ruling out, in this clashing with other things. That's what it means for an item to have a particular content.
Well, Ulf, you said ruling out or ruling in, and those correspond to incompatibility and implication, the reason relations. I mean, you can focus on either one of them. The same sorts of things we'll be able to say about either of them.
Yeah, that's right. It will be useful for me to focus on the ruling out, because that works so nice with the out of boundness the Risley, but
Well, but we know how to
yes.
understand implication in those terms. So.
Right. So one way to say that then is to say the role that something must play in order to be contentful is a role in reason relations. And what those reason relations are is that they have this modal oomph behind them. That's what the incompatibility and consequence are essentially modal. That's why it also corresponds to the thing that I brought in modality at the very start of the definition of consequence in Truthmaker theory. This is another reflection of this part of our view. Essentially modal. Now, but this modality can come in different flavors. The clashing can come in different flavors. The clashing or the ruling in or ruling out can come in the deontic normative flavor or in a lethic modal flavor. So for normative bilateralism, it comes in a deontic normative flavor, right? The position is out of balance. Asserting everything in gamma and denying everything in delta is normatively out of balance. It's not to be done in some sense. Incorrect to do. Whereas in the Truthmaker theory, we have a lethic modality doing the job. So it's that the state that makes all of the premises true and all of the conclusions false is an impossible state. It's not a bad state. It would also be a bad state, but that's not what it means for them to follow. What it means for them to follow is that this is an impossible state. All such states are impossible states. And what we, or at least I think, is that what it means for something to have content is to play a role with respect to other meaningful items of the same variety, the same sort, and which kind of items those are determines what is the kind of modality that is at play. When we talk about discursive acts, different kinds of discursive acts, the relevant kind of modality is deontic normative. If we talk about worldly states, the relevant kind of modality is a lethic modal. And that means that you get a bimodal view, right? A view with two modalities, and you think that content can occur as roles in both of these modalities. I want to briefly comment on differences. One, actually, it's just one small difference between the view that I've just rehearsed and the view that Bob calls bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism in Beyond Saying and Doing.
Mostly in the Hegel book.
Yeah. Right. The Hegel book, yes. And there you understand content as the matter, whereas now we understand content as the form. And the same content can occur in different matter, and we think of the kind of acts as the matter that are informed. So the kind of items that are that stand in those modal relations are the matter. So discursive acts on the subjective, kind of normative side, and worldly states on the lethic side. It's one difference. And to me, this matters a bit later on when I start talking about Aristotle. It allows me to be more Aristotelian in a certain way, as you will see. Now, I will also say that this content is form, as I just said, in a very Aristotelian sense, in two senses. So the first is that what matters for content is not the matter that, like the items that are contentful. And I think that is easily understood. I mean, if you think about the fact that words in different languages can mean the same thing, you realize that it's not their shape or their color or their sound or something that carries the meaning, right? What makes them meaningful in the right way is the relation to other words in this language. We think, of course, there are cases where these things, shape, color, weight, matter for meaning, but by and large, for words, they typically don't. So what matters is the incompatibility. What matters for the meaning is this ruling out. And that's what I want to call a form. I want to call this the rational form of the meaningful item. And I think that's a good name for it for three reasons. And those are three reasons that I take to be reasons for a good Aristotelian to call something a form. The first is that it gives those items a certain kind of unity. One way to see that is that it gives the item unity of same saying. So something has the same content and therefore is equivalent to other items in content when they're saying the same thing. And each item is also a unity because it has this one content, right? Where it breaks up the meaningful items into units, sentences, or speech acts that are the basic moves. They're the basic moves because they carry content. What it means to carry content is for those things to have these incompatibility relations. So it gives these items unity. There's a debate about propositional unity that is going on that I'm thinking about in the background. Second, it makes the items of a particular kind. What it is for a speech act to be a speech act of claiming that it's raining, like an assertion that it's raining, is that the assertion is incompatible with other assertions. And that is its role in an incompatibility relation, incompatibility and implication relation, reason relation. So that role makes the item what it is, in the sense that it makes the item a claiming of its raining, an assertion of its raining, or a denial of its raining, as the case may be, or whatever else. Yeah. And third, saying that it has this role specifies the intrinsic powers of the item, in the sense that it tells you what the item rules out in this relation of ruling in and out. It tells you what it rules in and tells you what it rules out. And that, I think, is something that you can plausibly see as the intrinsic power of that item. Now, if you have any Aristotelian sympathies, then if you encounter something that gives something unity, makes it the kind of thing it is, and specifies its intrinsic powers, you will think that's the thing's form. That's what it is to be of the thing. So that's why I call these things forms, and why I'm happy to say that the contents are forms. That brings me to the Aristotelianism of this. And I want to end basically by just rehearsing some aspects of a traditional Aristotelian view about what it means for thought or reason, judgment to be about something, to meet with reality in the right way, to be about that bit of reality and get it right or wrong. So the first is that the view that I put on the table, or that I sketched at least for you today, says that there are parallel relations of ruling out. There is a normative relation of ruling out, and that is in play with normative bilateralism. And then there is a lethic way of ruling out, and that is in play between states in Truthmaker theory. And I want to show you first that Aristotle in the categories has a very similar thought. So in the categories, Aristotle says, what underlies an affirmation or negation is not itself an affirmation or negation. So I take him what he means by underlies here is what makes these things true or false. For an affirmation is an affirmative statement and negation is a negative statement, whereas none of the things underlying an affirmation or negation is a statement. These are, however, said to be opposed to one another as affirmation and negation are. For in these cases, too, the manner of opposition is the same. For in the way an affirmation is opposed to negation, for example, he's sitting to he's not sitting, so are opposed the actual things underlying each, his sitting and his not sitting. His sitting makes true the sentence. He is sitting, his not sitting makes true the sentence. He is not sitting. And Aristotle tells us that those are opposed in the same way. And I take it what he means there is that there is a parallel ruling out relation that I want to understand as normative on the one side and deontic on the other side. And that's also, I think, the correspondence between the metaphysical and the psychological principle of non-contradiction. You get the ruling out on the metaphysical side and on the psychological side, the side of judgment. They're opposed in the same way, as I said. Now, once we have that on the table, we can wonder what it means for Aristotle for thought to be about something. Now, Aristotle typically doesn't think in terms of facts. He typically thinks in terms of objects, in particular in terms of substances usually. And he often thinks that you know substances. So for example, for him, it's a perfectly understandable thing to say that you know giraffes. But that he literally means is that you understand giraffes. You have knowledge of giraffes. Now, what is it for you to have knowledge of giraffes, for your knowledge to be about giraffes rather than about, I don't know, horses, let's say? Shields in a encyclopedia article, the SAP, has a nice summary that I think is accurate and helpful. He says that according to Aristotle, S thinks O, where O is typically an object for him, if and only if first S has the capacity for receiving O's intelligible form, O acts upon that capacity by informing it, and as a result, S's relevant capacity becomes isomorphic to that form. Now, I want to say this parallelism between normative bilateralism and truthmaker theory allows us to say something very similar. What it means for me, for example, to assert something about giraffes is, first of all, my capacity for assertion must be able to receive the forms of whatever I want to say about the giraffe. Giraffe is eating, let's say, but because we're dealing with sentences, not with objects, as I was talking about. Second, I must stand in the right rapport with the giraffe. Somehow I must manage to inform my capacity in the right way. And third, as a result of that, my capacity, for example, of taking up positions in discursive space must become isomorphic to the giraffe eating. And what it means to be isomorphic, I think that's what is explained by the isomorphism between normative bilateralism and truthmaker theory. Let me give a quote from De Anima, where Aristotle says how he sees things there. So Aristotle says, explaining the idea of what it means to be about something. Within the soul, the faculty of knowledge and sensation are potentially these objects. The one that is knowable and the other what is sensible. So he holds this view about the intellect and about sensibility. We only care about the knowability parts of the knowledge of the rational part of the soul, not the sensible part. They must either be the things themselves or their forms. The form alternative is, of course, impossible. It is not the stone which is present in the soul, but its form. It follows that the soul is analogous to the hand. For as the hand is a tool of tools, so thought is the form of forms, and sense the form of sensible things. So what he says is, what is shared between the intellect and the thing that the intellect is about in the relevant cases, so in the cases in which you understand something, is the form. So when you understand the giraffe, then your mind takes on the form of the giraffe. And I think we have a way of explaining this, because what it takes for discursive position, for example, something you can take up in thought, or something you could take up in discourse, social discourse with other people, to be about, to take on the form of the state of the giraffe eating, is for your assertion or your denial, in this case it's an assertion, to have the same form as the state of the giraffe eating. And what that means, that they have the same form, the same rational form, as I call it, is that they play analogous roles, meaning isomorphic roles relative to the other meaningful items. Now, the other meaningful items for the state of the giraffe eating are the otherworldly state. The relevant other contentful items for my assertion that the giraffe is eating are the other meaningful assertions and denials, the other meaningful speech acts, and they share their form because they share their modal role, the role in their modality. Now, for Aristotle, this view about what it means to be about something, what it means for my thoughts to be about giraffes, has a striking implication. It has the implication that the mind is not material. So he says that in the Anima, in the following passage, since everything is a possible object of thought, mind, in order to know, must be pure of all mixtures. For the co-presence of what is alien to its nature is a hindrance and block. It follows that it can have no structure of its own other than that of having a certain capacity. Thus, that in the soul, which is called thought, by which I mean that whereby the soul thinks or judges, is before it thinks not actually any real thing. And he, in the same passage, he tells you that means that thought cannot be a physical process, cannot be a material process. In contrast, for example, to imagination, which according to Aristotle is perfectly well, can be and is a material process. Just a side note, I think there's an interesting connection here to the Tractatus, especially I have at the bottom of this slide quote from Tractatus 2.1712, where Wittgenstein says, the picture can represent every reality whose form it has. The picture, however, cannot represent its form of representation that shows it forth. And I think that he's getting at something very similar here, that if the picture has, as it were, features that get in the way of it picturing because they, as it were, restrict the way in which the picture can vary, then it cannot represent that thing. So that's why a picture can represent only the things whose form it shares. Now, for Aristotle, form is something very specific. So, for example, something being blue is part of its form, maybe. What Wittgenstein means by form here is something more determinable. So he really means just being colored. He mentions being colored in the things that I left out here, or being spatial, things like that. So they don't mean the same thing with form. Aristotle means a specific instance. Wittgenstein means the determinable thing. But what they share is that they think in order to picture something, the medium that takes on the picture must not distort the picture, must, as it were, be open to that picture, and hence must not contribute something of its own. Because if it contributes something of its own, it distorts that picture. Right? And Wittgenstein then goes on to infer from that the picture cannot represent itself, because for that it would have to represent something of substance about itself that it already has, that property gets in the way of showing that. Now, why do I say all of that? Well, because this is all very speculative, but I'm thinking the necessity for logical frameworks to be able to incorporate open reason relations is a lot like the idea that Aristotle and Wittgenstein are sharing here, that if you want something that can stand in the right contact with reality, then that thing must be open enough to take on these forms. And if it's the case, for example, that the relevant forms of states are such that they are forms meaning modal roles, right? Roles relative to other states in an analytic modality that are non-monotonic and non-transitive, then your framework for codifying those roles has to be non-monotonic or non-transitive. Otherwise, you just won't get the right roles in them. So what corresponds to the non-materiality of the soul in Aristotle is, in our framework, the openness of the reason relations that we get. Okay, so summarizing the comparison with Aristotle, how Aristotelian are we? Well, I should really say I, because this is really me, the Aristotelian among the people who are engaged in this project is mostly me. But I would say the rational forms of assertions and denial of P, let's say, is identical to the rational form of states that make P true or false. It's identical because the form is individuated as this role that doesn't care about the modality or the matter. And once you abstract away from that, the isomorphism becomes an identity, right? So the form is identical, it's just in matter in two different ways. To think that P is to engage in a mental act, and if you want, you can let it be a discursive act. Aristotle thought about mental first, but you can think about a social act of asserting first if you want that. I'll get to this in a moment. So to think that P is to engage in a mental act with the rational form of the worldly state that makes P true, that makes the sentence P true. And just as the state obtaining is part of the world, right? So it's an obtaining state, a state that is part of actuality, is part of the world. So a thought can be a part of one's overall position. It can be one's overall position is made up by those things. And in that sense, it can also inform one's whole state of mind. Now, differences between us, or at least me and Aristotle, are, first of all, as mentioned, we think of forms of states, worldly states. That's given by the Truthmaker semantics that deals with states, not with objects. Where Aristotle thinks first and foremost about objects. Second difference, we tend to think firstly about social discursive acts and not about thought immediately. Aristotle clearly thinks that thought is primary and speech is, in an important sense, secondary to that. Even though you might, they're tricky exegetical question of Aristotle here, but that's the flat-footed reading of Aristotle. And third, what is the immateriality of the soul for Aristotle becomes for us the openness of consequence relations, the openness of reason relations, meaning that for our thought to be able to touch reality in the right way, and for our logical frameworks to capture or codify the structure in the right way, they must not get in the way of taking on these forms. And we think that requires that they can take on non-transitive and non-monotonic reason relations. Okay, let me summarize what I said so far. So, normative bilateralism and truthmaker theory are isomorphic. We can recover many well-known logics in strictly parallel ways in both frameworks, but we can have a sequence calculus, then do a truthmaker theory for them, or the other way around. Both frameworks can encode open, meaning non-monotonic and non-transitive reason relations, including suitably expressive logical vocabulary. I haven't talked about that. I mean, I gave you the clauses for the logical vocabulary in truthmaker theory, but I haven't talked about what it means for them to be expressive in the right way. This actually is really important, but it would require that I talk about other things. For example, this framework allows you to have a conditional such that the conditional follows from something if and only if that thing together with the premise implies the conclusion. And you can show that this is not really possible if you do things in a certain other way. And that would make this vocabulary not suitably expressive. But for that, I would have to talk about the alternative that I didn't want to talk about. Why other ways of going non-monotonic. Many other ways of going non-monotonic don't allow you to do that. It's a different part of the story. Fourth point, what differs between the frameworks, so the normative bilateralism and truthmaker theory, is first that there are different items that stand in reason relations. So you have discursive acts on the one side and you have worldly states on the other side. And that comes with a second difference, namely a difference in the modality that governs them. So you have deontic, normative modality governing the discursive acts, and you have alithic modality governing the worldly states. The content of an item is its role in those reason relations. And this role is, I claim, its form qua contentful item. And we can thus have the same forms in both frameworks. And these forms occur then in different matters, in discursive acts on the one side and worldly states on the other side, and relative to different modalities, but it's still the same role that they play. Once you replace the acts for one another and the modalities for one another, you get the same result. As a result, we have a bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realisms. The contents are forms that can be in matter and hence be real in different ways. As just said, discursive acts versus worldly states. And the role relative to modalities. And I think this allows us to recover an Aristotelian insight about what it is for a thought that P to take on the form of a worldly item that one thinks about in having that thought. So the worldly state that I think about in thinking that P, if I think truly, shares, according to this view, its form. But I thought that P and the state of it being the case that P share their form. And that's what mind and the world share when they meet in cognition and the right. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ulf. And I wonder whether all of you expected, when Ulf started this, to find the secret of how thought can be about the world in the sort of isomorphism of frameworks that he can work out in mathematical detail here. Never mind an insight into the immateriality of the soul. I have to admit that one surprised me. But this is sort of the key insight, that intentionality, the relation between mind and world, between language and the world, is something that we can study using the tools that we have been putting on the table. And at the core of that is this isomorphism between representationalist truthmaker semantics on the one hand, and what we can say in a pragmatic metavocabulary of in normative deontic terms that Ulf has set up. And the key to that, again, is his seeing how the definition of reason relations from the pragmatic side, in terms of the out-of-boundness of conjoining a set of commitments to accept the premises and a set of commitments to reject the conclusions, the fact that you can't be jointly entitled to those commitments can be carried over. That very same notion of what implication is and what incompatibility is can be carried over to the truthmaker framework if we talk about consequence in a way that Fine and his students have not considered at all. namely thinking about an implication as good, the consequences holding, if the fusion of all the truth makers of the premises and the falsity makers of the conclusions is an impossible state. So that's the core thing that is making this fabulous isomorphism that Ulf has identified work. So I wonder, before we let Ulf go, are there questions or comments that people wanted to make about this? I should say I've put his deck of slides on the website so that if something went past too fast, you can come back and look at it. And many of the formal details that he spared us the rehearsal of here are in the second of the pieces, the published article that was on the reading list. So, if you want to drill down and see more of it, that's where it is. Any last questions or comments? Well, then, thank you so much, Ulf, for joining us. And we will come back next week to hear Dan introduce his semantics for the contents that are common to these two sides. But the story that Ulf has told us is the big punchline of the book that we are trying to pull together. So I hope you find it as exciting as I do. Thank you, Ulf. See the rest of you next week.